have to speak English unfortunately. There are some little students here, I suppose. So yeah, you okay. So welcome to the research seminar organized by the Business School. And today's topic is about how to successfully complete your master or PhD thesis, and how to turn your research findings into something that is publishable. You might want to know why it's important to publish your article, your research article, because for PhD thesis it's quite important. It's part of your requirement, to complete a degree. You need to publish. You need to publish your research results in at least TCI1, right, journal. Domestic publication is not. But if you can somehow turn your research into something that is publishable internationally, then you increase the chance of passing the exam without major revision. Let's just say that because you're gonna put an impression on the examiner. Suppose I come to pass your exam and I see that you have published your research results in a very good journal, then I probably won't be too picky regarding asking you any questions. There's one senior, your senior came to the seminar last year, I think. Ajahn All from Malaysia University. She came to the seminar and attended the research clinic. Also submitted her paper for Michael to review. She got heaps of comments, but she ended up with for Thai too, of a Scapa journal, and she just completed her PhD this year. On the exam day, she finished. I mean, she passed the exam with only minor revision, and that's why it's important to publish your research result in a very good journal to make your examiner impressive about your research. And but taking that aside, I mean, first step is to complete your thesis first. And Michael, he completed his PhD in when he was 25, very young. He did it in 3 years. So today we're gonna find out, how he did it, and he also published probably 100 papers in, very good journal, and we're gonna find out too, how he did it. What else should I say about yourself?
What I do?
And associate professor, from Southern Cross Business School, and he also the director of graduate studies. Basically, he oversees all the master and PhD students, like for example, assigning examiners. Oversee the process of doing PhD, doing research, and also approve the examination. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Michael Chow.
All right. Okay, thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you Kasetsart Business School for inviting me once again. This is my third time in Thailand. I don't speak any Thai basically. I'll try to speak as slowly as I can. If I start speaking too quickly, if I start using words that are too complicated, please let me know. One thing I want to say at the beginning is that this isn't a place for me just to stand here in front of you and tell you what to do. I want you to think about what you're doing and your particular journeys, and I want you to ask questions. I want you to ask me about the things that you're worried about, and what sort of strategies might be offered to assist you with those particular problems you have. Each of you is going to have their own individual journey to get a Master's by Research or a PhD, and each of you need to adapt to the way in which you work, your particular topic, and the way you work with your supervisors. So everything I'm saying here today isn't going to be exactly the same for everyone else. Everyone's journey is going to be different, just as my journey was different to what your journey is going to be, and is different to what Nat's journey was, for example, when he was studying with me. I don't know if you mentioned I was your supervisor. All those years ago, when Nat came to my university to study a Doctor of Business Administration, looking at accelerated depreciation and what that would mean for replacing assets in the Australian rail industry. So as part of that process, I secured some funding for Nat to allow him to undertake his research and to travel around a bit and try to collect some data, etc., and to work with some industry partners. A lot of the PhDs in the future are probably going to be closely done with industry partners. I don't know if any of you here are working with industry or just working independently, but if you are working with industry partners, there's a whole lot of other complications that result, particularly when they are concerned about releasing data to you or whether you should be publishing the results, particularly if the results say things that they don't want to know or don't want to hear about. So you have to be very careful with those sorts of things. Is anyone here working with an industry partner? No? All just independent research? So
some of them are lecturers, I believe. Lecturers? Anyone?
No? All right. Okay, so what we're going to do today basically is talk about, I understand that a lot of you here, or mainly, are beginning your journey with respect to doing a PhD or a Master's by Research. So I'm going to talk to you about what that journey is about and the sorts of challenges you might come up with and how to overcome those challenges. Then we're going to take a bit of a break, around 10:20 or so for 10 minutes. Then when we come back, we'll look at what it means to publish an article in an international peer-reviewed journal. And what I'm going to do is we're going to work on a hypothetical case of an article that is related to Bangkok. So I chose something that I've thought about before the last time I came here, and it's something very familiar, I think, to most of you. It's about public transport and investment strategies with building public infrastructure. So I'm not assuming that all of you know much about infrastructure investment and so forth, but I want to use that as a bit of an example to show how you would develop an argument for an article, how you would structure that article, and how you'd finish it off. So can I get some sort of idea here of who's doing what sort of topic area? We'll start with you. What are you studying? What's your general topic area? Food science. So are you looking from a business perspective or a policy perspective or? Marketing, okay. So yeah, that's what I want to know. What sort of discipline area you're looking at?
Actually, I'm thinking about forex and kind of like forex is something big, but I'm not sure about it.
Foreign exchange.
Foreign exchange, forex, okay. So generally in a finance kind of area. So we've got marketing, finance.
I am thinking about hydroponic farming. So I would like to make a business plan for myself and carry it on later on.
Where are you from? Philippines. Okay.
About hydroponic farming, okay.
I'm in the field of Thai traditional medicine and in the public health.
So incorporating traditional Thai medicine in a public health setting. Is that what you're saying? Thai medicine, incorporating that into a public health setting.
And in the Ministry of Public Health.
Okay, so generally something to do with public health, maybe policy relating to health. Thanks.
Sure. For me, I work in the marketing area. Right now, I'm very interested in the branding, like brand action, brand jealousy, or the customer engagement.
Okay, so generally marketing, advertising. Yep.
I'm doing business administration, but not sure now what kind of topic I'll do in my thesis, but it tends to be management, I think.
Okay, management. Thank you.
For me, it's the management in the multinational company.
Management and multinational corporations. Is that a human resources type focus or organisational behaviour?
Human resource.
Human resources? Okay, thanks.
I haven't thought about it yet.
You haven't thought about it yet? Okay.
Related to my career. I work as an investment banker now, so it could be
Something along that
Finance.
finance line. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a mix there. There's a few people doing marketing / advertising, some policy stuff in there, and some finance. What I didn't realise when I came here is that it looks like a lot of people here are just sort of thinking about what kind of topic they want to explore. So I will probably need to talk a bit about that as well, selecting topics. So I was under the impression that most of you had probably locked into something. So that's something to talk about. Okay, as I said, feel free to ask questions. It's very noisy in here, isn't it, with that noise, but I'll try and talk above that. All right, just what I'm going to do, as I said, is just talk some general things for the first hour or so, just to give you a bit of background and some strategies for success. So I've got some good news here, basically, and that is very, very difficult to fail. Once you begin the undertaking, that's when the problems start. But actually submitting it, once you've submitted your thesis, it's very, very difficult to fail. That's what I've seen in my career administering PhD and Masters by Research programs. So that's the good news, basically. But here's some bad news. A lot of people don't get to the stage of submitting their PhD or their Masters by Research. They have family problems, they have work problems, they don't get the time to concentrate. So these are things that you need to bear in mind. Getting to the stage of submission, you're almost, with the hard work, you're almost guaranteed of getting your degree. But getting to the point of submitting something that your supervisors agree is worthy enough to be submitted, that's the difficult part. And it's a long, long way to getting to that particular point. So what I want to talk about now is how do we get people like you who are just starting this journey, as I said, to get to that point where they're submitting a thesis that their supervisory team is happy with and that examiners are going to be happy with as well. And when I did my PhD a long time ago, must be 15 years ago or something like that, I didn't have so many problems. I had a scholarship. I was paid by the government to study. So I was very lucky. And I also received additional income from lecturing and tutoring at the same time. Probably some of you here are going to be struggling with work issues, perhaps with having family and so forth. So there's lots of obstacles, lots of noise that's going on probably in your lives that you have to deal with. So how to separate that noise and concentrate on the task at hand of doing your PhD or Masters by Research, that's something I can't absolutely tell you how to do, but you need to work out strategies to make sure that you can separate your private, personal, income-generating lives with actually doing a PhD or a Masters by Research. Is there anyone here who thinks that they will have those sorts of problems, that they do have lots of conflict in their life, that they need to make money? I'm sure there's probably quite a few of you here that have that issue at hand. So you're not alone. The good news, as I said, is many, many people have got to the point of submitting a PhD or a Master's with all those problems in their lives. I was lucky that I didn't have that. Having
I had that.
Sorry?
I had that.
You had that?
Yeah.
See, we're the lazy people. We didn't have those problems.
Oh, right.
But a lot of you will have to be working, perhaps dealing with family, perhaps dealing with, I don't know, personal issues or boyfriends and girlfriends or what have you. All these sorts of things come up in life. You've got to put that noise to the side and try and find a way of concentrating and finding a space for you. So, as I said, let's talk about how we do that and also about how we can get you started to think very early about how you go about publishing as well. It's one thing at the end of your thesis journey to go, oh, here's some stuff, I'm going to publish it. As Nat said, it's a good idea to try to get something submitted before or possibly accepted before you submit your thesis so that other people are looking at your work aside from your supervisors. And we'll talk a bit about that later. But here's some things. If you're going to overcome those noise issues, as I said, you have to think about why you're studying in the first place. So I want to get a bit of a sense from you, first of all, of why do you want to do this? Come on, someone. Why are you studying? Why are you going to do a thesis? Why are you going to write a thesis?
I want to challenge myself, but But to finish this,
A personal challenge.
It's very hard one, but if I can pass it, it will be
So it's a personal challenge that you think you want to test yourself. That's a good start. Anyone else?
I've been a company employee for the rest of my life, so I have no business background. I wanted to have a business of my own someday. So that's why I took out the MBA.
So you're wanting to study for more of an applied purpose, to develop your professional skills, your practical skills,
Yes.
rather than just your intellectual, theoretical skills.
Yeah, you can say that.
Yeah. Anyone else? Is there any other reasons why they're studying? Over here, smiling and looking at each other. Come on, tell me, why are you studying?
Just a simple reason to maybe in the future I will get more money.
All right.
For
Okay.
example, I studied doctorate because I want to doctorize myself.
Right.
Bad example.
Yeah, these two examples are probably not the right reasons. The examples of I want to challenge myself, I want to learn, I want to be a better person at the end of the journey is the right reason. That you want to learn things that you can apply to the rest of your life, your professional life, is the right reason to do something. Sorry to pick on you,
It's okay. You can cover the whole.
but to do something just because you want money to get a better job, okay, you know, that's in the background. We're not. Let's not be stupid about this. We all want a better life for ourselves, and maybe education is a way to do that. But remember, you're undertaking an intellectual and in some cases practical exercise to convince some examiners that you're as good as they were at that particular point of their life. And that here is the other example of people who want to become an academic. Oh, I need to have a doctorate. Not the right reason to do it, really, to sort of doctorize yourself, as he said. That's not the right reason. So this is an important thing to think of and to keep it in your mind that you're here to learn. You're here to become a better person. You're here to accept the position of you're really an apprentice, that you have to undertake your masterpiece, really, to be admitted to where Nat and I are, basically, to get into the club. So, yeah, it's the right thing to do, to challenge yourself, to learn. And that's the important thing, especially, to learn, to recognise that you've got a lot to learn, and not to come into this position and go, I'm already a smart person. I just need to jump through a few hoops, satisfy some processes, and I get a PhD or I get a master's by research. That's not the way it works. Because examiners don't care about whether you are successful in making money. Examiners don't care about whether you get a job or not out of it. Examiners are concerned about whether this piece of work satisfies the requirements to receive a doctorate or a master's by research. So as I said, make sure you keep thinking about doing this for the right reasons, that you want to learn, that you're inquiring, that you're inquisitive, that you're prepared to challenge yourself. So yeah, I'll tell you why I did a PhD, because I was lazy. I didn't want a real job, and I got a scholarship because I got good grades, basically. So I survived, but I also, I guess, wanted to learn at the same time, and I think that's what got me through that particular journey. That I wanted to use that opportunity to not just do my PhD, but to learn around that area I was studying in as well. And that's an important thing to think about, that you're doing a PhD or a master's in a particular little area, but you need to be aware of a lot of the other literature around that field as well, because some of that might influence what you're doing. So don't just have this little microscopic view of your particular topic. Use this as an opportunity to learn more about marketing in a general sense, more about developing business plans in a general sense. That's the sort of thing that you should be thinking about when you're doing this. So again, that speaks to not just doing something to get a result, but doing something to learn at the same time. Because is anyone here wanting to become an academic? No one? One person? Okay. Two people.
But I don't think it will. I don't think
It's not for everyone, shall we say. In fact, I think you should just go and become a businessman and get rich. That's probably, yeah. So people who are thinking about becoming an academic, it becomes even more important for them to get in there early and learn not just about what your thesis area, but about that subject area in itself. Because no, you don't get a job just because you've written a thesis. Because if you can't teach anything more than that, then you're useless in academia. They don't have a subject at university that's just about your thesis. You'll have to teach a variety of different things. You'll have to eventually supervise other people in that broader discipline. So that's why it's important to become more familiar with your discipline as well as just your specific topic area when you're studying.
That's my student. That's my PhD student.
Bah.
Sitting over there.
Ah, yeah. Sitting anonymously,
yeah.
and quietly. All right, what I want to talk about now, given that you're at the very beginning of this journey, is what do you think a good thesis looks like? What does a good thesis have?
Originality and contribute something new to the field of your study.
Contributes something new? Yeah? The one issue with that is it's actually very difficult to contribute something absolutely new. You have to, it's almost a case of saying, I can offer a new interpretation of the way we've looked at something, or I offer a new perspective on the way we look at something. To actually do a PhD where you say, oh, I am going to come up with a new model of doing something, a new way, an entirely new, a new process of doing something is actually extremely difficult. And probably most people will never get to that. I certainly haven't created something absolutely new that I'm aware of. But you did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Nat created something not new, absolutely new. No, you didn't. You based it on other things. We're all standing on what other people have done before, and we're contributing to that field. So, but in a general sense, you have to convince your examiners that what you've done is sufficiently novel that you've made a contribution to knowledge. Not something entirely new, but a new perspective, a new slant, sometimes a way of applying something from another discipline to another discipline, or transferring knowledge from one discipline to another discipline. Any other ideas of what a good thesis might have? Our friend from the Philippines, I think, was going to say something before. Something.
Beneficial and usable and applicable.
Beneficial, usable, applicable. Sometimes, but not always. Some theses are very applied in that it's providing or coming up with something that can be used. So it makes a contribution to knowledge in the context of professional practice. Now you might have to be a little bit careful when you're doing that in the context of, are you doing a PhD or a master's? A master's, yeah. That's probably not so much of a problem with a master's, but with a PhD, there's also another path of a professional doctorate, which is what Nat did when he did his doctorate. He did a doctorate of business administration, which is about creating something that can be used by an end user. Whereas most of you are probably making a contribution to knowledge in a different way. A lot of people say that a PhD or a master's is making a theoretical contribution, which is not entirely true, because not many people actually generate a new theory. Most people are testing a theory, or perhaps adding some nuance to a theory, but there are very few theses. Less than 1% probably of all PhD theses across all disciplines actually create something that is a completely new theoretical contribution. One thing that's missing here that we're talking about in terms of what is a good attribute of a thesis And it's probably the most important one. It's the one a lot of people miss. Because I review so many theses, and one thing many people miss is a very simple one. Any ideas? Any further ideas? It's telling a good story.
Okay.
And that's the first thing I want you to think about as you're starting this journey, is how to tell a good story. It doesn't mean you're writing about Harry Potter or sharks eating people or love and romance and what have you, but you still have to write a clear, consistent, coherent narrative. In effect, you're telling a story, particularly if your research involves something that's experimental or using data or running data through a model or something like that. You are telling a story of why you started doing something, how it fits into what other people have done, how you are going to go about doing what you're going to do, what you found, what you did with what you found in terms of analysis, and then what it means for the rest of the discipline. So that's telling a story. At the fundamental heart of any thesis is good storytelling. And that just doesn't mean writing blocks of stuff. You have to connect everything through what we call segues, links. You can't expect the reader, the examiner, to make all these leaps of logic from here's a table, here's something you've written about the table, here's some stuff about what we can do with the table. You have to develop a way of telling a story. And you can probably recognize when you're reading in your area the good articles from the bad articles. The good articles that you read are the ones that engage you, that keep you interested. And often it's not just about the subject matter, it's the way in which they've engaged the reader. And you have to do the same thing with your examiners. If you can't tell a coherent story, if you make the examiners fill in the gaps, or have to fill in the gaps, then you're in trouble. That's certainly what I do when I'm reviewing theses, or examining theses, or even reviewing articles for referee journals. If an article in particular doesn't tell a nice, interesting story, regardless of what's contained within it, then I'm likely to reject it. So no matter how good your data is, no matter how meaningful your analysis is, if you can't link that back to why we should care about what you're doing, then you're in trouble. So that's, as I said, the most important thing. If you take anything home today, I want you to think of that. Storytelling. Look at the good storytellers. Follow what they do. Follow how they structure things. Follow how they present information in a logical, sequential way. They don't make you guess. They don't put chunks of information in the wrong place. Everything is carefully structured in a certain way to logically lead you through a story until you get to the end of the thesis and you go, wow, that made sense. I understood what this person is trying to tell me. They've convinced me that they've done something that's worthy of a PhD or a master's by research. Most important thing. Second idea I've got here is that it needs to cohere with the expectations of the discipline. In some respects, you're a bit of a slave. As I said, this is an apprenticeship, really. So you need to know what an examiner in your field is likely to want to see. Now, your supervisors are going to help you out with that. But your supervisors aren't going to be always the absolute expert in your specific sub-discipline, your little bit of your discipline. So what you need to do is look at things like, how is information normally presented? Is it written in a very objective style? Is it written with a bit more personal colour in it? Is it written in a more of a colloquial way or a very professional, serious, studied way? There's all different ways of presenting things. For example, a lot of the social sciences tend to use what I call a false objectivity when they write. They will say, it is expected that, or it was found that. They like to put everything in a passive construct to distance themselves from it, which from another perspective seems quite false or artificial. But if that's the way the discipline does it, then don't try to make waves. Don't try to disrupt things too much. Do that later when you can, when you've got your thesis accepted. In other disciplines, for example, the style might be a little more direct. Like, I did this, or we did this. But it's different according to the discipline. So there are norms within each discipline that you need to recognize and understand. So your best friends in all this are the fellow academics who came before you, who have written about that area. Try to be like them in as much as you can. That's the way you learn, by imitating first of all. Once you've learned to imitate, then you can add your own particular colour to what you're doing. So each of you, I want you to think about that. Recognise your discipline. What is the normal way of writing? What is the normal way of presenting data? Some disciplines, for example, like a big chapter about the methods and the ontological positioning of you yourself when you're writing, and your views on the epistemology of how you treat knowledge, and are things real, or is there a subjectivity or a relativist position? Particularly in the social sciences, they love all this kind of stuff. In other disciplines, however, probably finance, you don't need any of that sort of stuff. You don't need to explain that, oh, I view the world in this particular way. Again, think of what your particular discipline wants you to do. Don't jump outside that particular paradigm at this particular stage in your career. The last of the three, what I think are the three most important things to be mindful of, is make sure it looks well presented and looks inviting. If it looks like rubbish, the examiner might think it's rubbish. It might seem as if you didn't care enough to present it nicely. Maybe you didn't care enough to specify your model correctly. Maybe you didn't care enough when you tried to work out which variables you should use, and so forth. So it's the same as most things in life. If you've got a nice clean car and you've got a really dirty car over here, which one are you going to buy if they're the same price? You'll buy the clean one. Because you might think the clean car means that the owner has cared about his or her car, has made sure the oil has been changed when it should be changed, has made sure that the brake pads have been changed when they needs to be changed. All those sorts of things. Maybe driven it in a more sedate manner. Hasn't run over lots of bumps in the road. The same thing with your thesis. It needs to look as good as it can, to be very well presented. I can't emphasize that enough. I've seen so many theses that contain good material, but examiners don't accept it initially because it needs to be half rewritten. Now, are most people here writing in English or in Thai?
Probably in Thai.
You'll be writing in Thai. Okay, well, make sure you get your Thai grammar correct. Make sure you get your Thai spelling correct, because examiners can be very, very pedantic about these sorts of things. And I'm not exactly sure about the process at Kasetsart, but you don't want to have your thesis go back to an examiner after you've made all of these revisions if you don't have to. It's often the case that the examiner will say, I like the content, I think it makes a contribution, but it's written very, very badly. The grammar is bad, the spelling is bad, the presentation is bad. I want to have another look at it before I approve it. And that's delaying your life. It's stopping you getting on with the other things that you want to do in life. The best thing is to make it look as good. And guess what? A thesis that looks good often gets through, and that's not very good, gets through sometimes more easily than a good thesis that looks bad. Fact. And I've seen many theses go through that are not, they don't really make much, they're a very lightweight thesis. They don't really say much. But it tells a nice story. It looks lovely. It's well presented. Examiners go, oh, that looks nice. They skim through it. Yeah, that person looks like they know what they're doing. Tick of approval. Whereas a thesis where someone has put so much work into it, and it's original and different, but they haven't been able to put it all together properly. You don't want to get to that particular position. So 3 things there that I really want you to think about. Most important things, as I said, that you'll take out of today are probably that. Okay, examiners. Now, as I said, examiners don't really care about you. All they really will care about is whether you've met the standard that goes with a master's by research or a PhD. But the one thing that the literature tells us about higher research degree education literature is that examiners have an optimism bias. That's good news. That means they want you to pass. So don't give them any kind of things to not want to pass you. As I said, once your thesis gets submitted, it's very difficult to fail. But you want to make that journey as easy as possible. So don't give them an opportunity. Don't let them say, hey, this person can't write Thai properly or can't write English properly. You don't want that. Or this person can't organise his or her ideas properly. You don't want that. So as I said, don't give them excuses not to pass you. We've talked a bit about before about expectation management. Each examiner will have an idea of what they think a PhD or a Master's by Research looks like. That might be different to Nat's idea. We might have quite different ideas, and you need to get a bit of a sense of that. Your supervisory team and whoever approves of examiners also needs to think of those sorts of things as well. For example, if in your particular discipline area a certain method is not very well appreciated or it's controversial, then make sure it doesn't go out to an examiner who has been on the record of saying, I think that method is stupid. So do the candidates put forward any ideas about who might examine here, or is it entirely up to
Supervisor.
Entirely up to the supervisor? You can't influence the supervisor in any way?
You can.
You can. I'm sure that happens.
You can. Yeah.
I mean, where I come from,
Well, it's a lot of gifts, from students. So yeah, that's influential.
in my university, the candidate cannot know who is examining until after the process has occurred. But the candidate can tell the supervisor, hey, there's Professor what have you that I think is a bit of an idiot, and I think that person will hate what I've written. Or this particular person I think will like what I've written because he uses a similar method to me and I agree with his findings, or something like that. So, yeah.
Can a student choose a researcher in case that the advisor has how do you call that? Is known to be a hard one.
Well, that's your supervisors want you to succeed because it looks good for them.
We can have a talk. I mean, before you submit your thesis, I will, for example, if I'm your supervisor, I will nominate, potential examiners, and for you to look at, and are you happy with these names or not? If you're not, and we can come up with different names. But I have to make sure that you don't know that person, personally.
Well, as I said, I don't know exactly how it works here, but certainly in most Australian universities, you're not meant to know. You shouldn't have absolute knowledge of who is examining your thesis.
It's different, because here you have to do the oral examination. So they have to meet the examiner.
And that's before they read the thesis or after?
After.
After.
They have to submit first, and then we set up, oral examination process. Then students have to prepare the slide.
Will they know who their examiners are when they submit their thesis?
I believe so. Yeah.
All right.
No,
so
the supervisor will.
So you've got an ability to influence who's looking at your work. If that's the case, then use it. Because you're the person who knows most, or will know most, about that little bit of your discipline. You will know the academics who will hate what you've done. You will know the academics who might like what you've done. So if you have the potential to influence your supervisors to choose the academics that might give you an easy passage, then that's in your best interest to try and get those people examining your thesis, and also to make sure that your thesis is exactly what those kinds of examiners want to see. So in sociology, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of something called grounded theory, for instance. A lot of researchers will absolutely hate a thesis that uses grounded theory. So you would never submit a thesis that uses that particular way of doing things to examiners who are on the public record of saying that they don't like this or they don't use that particular way of doing research. And finally, once you get feedback from your examiners, don't get angry. Don't pretend that you know more than they do. That, oh, they're idiots, they didn't understand what I'm doing. Usually that means that you didn't tell the story properly. Let's go back to the storytelling. If they didn't get what you did...
Which is why the second part of today's seminar is important. You know, if you publish in something that is very good, they're not going to be asking a lot of questions.
Well, no, you can influence them in that way, certainly, if you can get a publication out. Hey, this person's already done something that's been approved. Therefore, I'll probably just go along with that instead of finding reasons to go against that. So, but when you get the feedback from your examiners, always remember that your job is to, you know, a bit of genuflection to get through, even if you don't entirely agree with what they say to you. And always remember that the feedback that they give you will be of immense use if you want to then take some of your research further to publish more stuff from your thesis, because it's likely that other reviewers of articles from your thesis will come up with the same criticisms. So the examination process is designed to make sure that you produce a work that's going to cohere with the standards of your discipline. So listen to what the custodians of that discipline have to say about your thesis. So this is getting back a bit to the beginning, which I think makes sense for a lot of people here who are just at the beginning of this journey. Important point, you're going to have to live with this for a few years. If you hate your topic 6 months in, then you are in big, big, big trouble. You'll be struggling to get up in the morning to do the work. You'll find all sorts of excuses. You'll go shopping. You'll go swimming. You'll go drinking. You'll go eating. You'll do whatever it is. But you won't be writing your thesis because it doesn't interest you enough. That's going back to some of those points I made earlier. You absolutely have to be interested in what you're doing. Or interested enough, shall we say. It's not about having no other life. It's about making this an important and viable part of your life that you have control over. So, yeah.
About the topic of the thesis, I'm wondering if I should choose the topic that you say that topic that I like, but if I have two topics, I like both, but one topic I tend to have more background. In others, I have less background, but the one that I have less background is tend to be easier to gather the data. But the one that I have more stronger, have stronger background tends to be harder to access to the data. Which one should I do?
My view, if your discipline area is data driven, then go for the data. You will learn enough about how to construct something around that.
In spite of the fact that I have less background about that.
What do you mean by less background? About just the discipline area, or about the literature?
I mean the knowledge about that discipline.
If you're still interested in the area, I would go for where you know you can get good quality data. Nat, for example, we had lots of difficulties together with his thesis because we thought we could get data and we didn't get the data that we wanted because the industry partners got worried about what the outcome of the research would say.
So you recommend that you recommend that I should go for the data?
I think that, well, I don't know enough about your particular problem, but certainly if you're in a data-driven discipline, then having access to high-quality data, or if it's already available, if it's secondary data, and a lot of, were you doing fine?
I'm doing
Marketing.
business administration, and
Oh, the HR kind of a thing.
Yeah, but from my master, I graduated a master of international business.
Yes.
So it's like management with international settings.
Well, it goes back to a point I said. It's a very, very good question. It goes back to a point I said earlier, that writing a thesis is about challenging yourself and learning something. If you know you've got good quality data, if you're interested in the area, if you want to learn about the area, then you will learn as much as you need. But if you're constructing a model or specified a model of something and you need data and you've got no idea how you're going to do that, you've got no connections with that industry,
So it's like,
that's a problem.
So it's like go for the data and learn something new in the process?
Not knowing your exact story, I would probably tend towards that. I mean, particularly if it's difficult to publish, for example, if you haven't got high quality data. If it's a data-driven, if it's a management, HRE kind of organisational behaviour, having access to good data, having friends in the industry or in a government department, or if for people doing finance, if there's already a whole lot of data from a particular stock exchange or what have you, or whatever it happens to be, then you will learn enough. The other thing to pay attention to is, can you actually use that data? Do you have the ability to analyse that data? Do you know certain programs that you will need? Like if you needed structural equation modelling, for example, if you are looking at different variables in an organisational setting that influence the affect of employees for their organisation. If you don't know how to do the technique to use that data, then you're in trouble as well. You might have good data, but you don't know what to do with it. So it's not as easy for me to just say, do one thing, do another thing. There's all different issues to bear in mind. But certainly access to good data is a very good start. Then you need to consider, can I manipulate that data? Have I constructed a reason for doing the research that the data speaks to? Will the data be able to inform my hypotheses? So as I said, it's without knowing the exact details, I can't give a definitive answer on that. I don't know if that helps or not, but okay. Any other questions about that kind of a thing? If you're at this beginning stage and you're really wondering, should I do this or should I do that? I mean, one thing that I often tell people is, are you interested in a sector? And if you are interested in a certain sector, it makes things easier. Even if you're not absolutely an expert on some of the techniques or what have you, you'll learn because you're interested enough. For example, you might do something about HR, let's just say, for example. But is it HR in the context of the health industry? And you go, I just hate the health industry, it's really boring. I'm not interested in the health industry. Or do you want to do HR in the aviation industry? In airline management? Oh, I like airlines, I'm interested in the aviation industry. It makes a big difference when you're even just dealing with the context that you find interesting. So that's another thing I often advise people to bear in mind when they're choosing a topic. Because some things, industries, I just find incredibly boring. I'm not interested. Even though it's a similar issue I could transplant that issue from this industry to this industry. But if I'm not interested in the context, it becomes difficult to maintain the critical interest that you'll need to have. And if you're doing something in an industry that interests you, well, it might open a few doors for your future career as well. If you are interested in I don't know, attracting more female pilots in the aviation industry, developing strategies for doing that, for example, it might open doors for you to work in the aviation industry as a management consultant or so forth. So if there's an industry that's interesting to you, then linking yourself to that industry, it helps a lot with your enthusiasm, I find. Even now, I'm working on various projects with different partners. But the ones I really like are the ones that are connected to an industry I really like. And for example, I do things that are associated with local government, but I find local government really boring, like municipal councils and so forth. But I'm currently working on a project of what I was just talking about before, of listening to women's experiences in the aviation industry and what kind of barriers do they have in developing countries as opposed to developed countries about becoming a pilot. I'm interested because I'm interested in the aviation industry, and that helps me be interested in the project. And I also think it's an important topic as well. So you've got to have that combination of various interests. One thing that you don't want to have, though, is where you want to be the prophet, that you need to prove something because you know it's right. For example, we need more women in the aviation industry and I'm going to prove it. That's not the right thing about things. You want to inquire, you want to ask questions, you want to develop knowledge. You don't want to write a research project that's about becoming a prophet for something, that we need more governance for small companies about to do an IPO. Okay. But you don't want to become the prophet of this. You don't want to preach. A thesis that preaches often makes bad choices because you have a kind of a confirmation bias, because you already know the answer you want to get. When you're doing research like that, examiners are going to say, hey, wait on, you've made this whole thing to end up with a certain result. That's not good research. That's going to cause you problems. Finally on this, ask yourself why people will care about the topic. It can't just be something that's interesting to you. It has to have some kind of impact on at least how many examiners or whatever it is?
5.
There at least needs to be 5 people in the world who really care about what you're doing to get through this. If not, people are going to suffer from catastrophic interest failure and will just switch off when they're reading your thesis. If they switch off when they're reading your thesis, they won't understand it because they don't care enough. So make sure you're doing something that people will be interested in. Okay, now, as I said, I'm just going to go through some sort of strategies for success. And these are things that I've learned from managing programs of research training. Have a vision of what your thesis will look like. When you start, you're starting now, a lot of you. What you are doing now, or thinking about doing now, is going to be a bit different to what you end up with. So you can't blueprint a thesis necessarily. You'll go through a confirmation of candidature. You'll present a research proposal. You'll have people assess that research proposal. But that thing there is not a blueprint. Your thesis, your methods can change slightly by the time you get to the end. Your confirmation of candidature is about whether you have a viable research project to execute, an executable research project that you can go out and do. But it won't be exactly that. So it's the difference between a vision, and this is the word I like to use, a vision of what your research is about, and a blueprint, where it follows exactly this. But if you have a blueprint and something doesn't work out, then you're in trouble. If you needed 10 firms and you only ended up with 8 to cover the amount of variables or whatever it is, then you have to accommodate that. You have to argue why you can get away with 8 firms instead of looking at 10 or whatever it happens to be. So you have to be able to accommodate change because things will happen that you won't like. Nat,
Exactly, yeah.
you had a very good example of this. He had to change from a very real, empirically driven thesis to more of a theoretical thesis because we had problems securing the data that was promised to us.
I had to do a simulation. Remember?
A what?
A simulation.
A simulation, yes. He had to simulate the effects of changing the way in which equipment was depreciated as opposed to how the firms actually depreciated it. So the end result was the same. The vision was the same, to see whether accelerated depreciation schedules would encourage firms to re-equip more quickly. The idea was, if we re-equip more quickly, will we be helping the environment by using more efficient trains or rolling stock? That was the idea behind the thesis. So the vision was the same, but the way of going about it differed quite markedly to what we expected in the first instance. That's a very radical thing. Hopefully this will not happen to you. But there will be
It's not fun.
it's not fun, and yeah. But there will be small changes that you'll need to accommodate as you go through. So, as I said, flexible, you need to be. But you should still maintain, you need to lock in a vision of what you think your thesis is meant to do. If that changes, you're in big trouble halfway through. So you have to have a very coherent vision of what it is. And that's why your supervisors and your panel are there for when it comes to your confirmation of candidature, to check whether you have an executable research plan, not whether you're going to absolutely do everything you say. Writing. This is a thing that gets a lot of people. Some people are natural writers. Some people are natural thinkers. The problem is, the thinkers need to communicate in writing because that's what the examiner reads. A lot of people, I have this problem all the time when people come to me, oh, I haven't got as far as I wanted to because I'm still reading the literature. And that says to me, you're procrastinating, you don't really understand what you're doing, you haven't developed a vision for what you're doing. You've got to get in early and start writing. You don't have to, I mean, the miracle of modern technology means that you can write stuff, cut and paste bits of what you've written previously, put it into this section, move it to that section. Don't cut and paste from websites though. I'm only talking about your own work. But that's what you can do. Some things will drift out of your thesis, some things can drift back into your thesis. But start writing. Start writing about the problems. Start critiquing what you read. Don't just come up with so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. Group things together. All of these people think this, all of these people think that. There's a problem because how can they both be right? So get in there early. Start critiquing what you're reading. Start reflecting. It's your job to be critical. It's your job to not be descriptive. It's your job to be the expert in the field. It's not your job to just tell the examiner what they already know. So a way to get in there is to start writing. Get into the habit of writing. And the important thing for me is when you feel like writing, then write. No matter what time it is. I know, yes, I've got to go pick up the kids from school, or my girlfriend's doing this, or blah, 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 blah. Yeah, we've all got to accommodate those things in life. But if you wake up on Sunday morning and you're thinking, oh, I was going to go to the gym and then I was going to do some shopping, but actually I really am energized about writing today, then do it. Because on Monday you probably won't feel like that. So you've got to grab the opportunity when it strikes. The other inverse of that is some people go, all right, I've got 2 hours to write today and then I'm going to do 2 hours tomorrow. Unproductive work is often what results from those particular, looks like we have a practitioner here of that. Look, there's a different way for doing this for everyone. And I can't tell you exactly how to do things because you've got your own personality, your own life, etc. But what I do know is that you can achieve more in 4 hours when you really, really want to write something than you can stuffing around for 5 days, flicking through the internet, looking at the scores of football matches or what clothes you want to buy or where you want to go on holiday and coming back and then going back, having a look at what fashions are available this week or what are your friends doing on Facebook or some rubbish like that, and then writing a bit more and then going back. That's not productive writing. When you actually get in there, I can sometimes write half a paper in a day because I'm actually in the zone. So just think of that. You can't force yourself to do this. It's not like studying necessarily. It's more involved than studying and just reading. And the other thing is find a place to write that works for you so there isn't any excuses. The traffic's too noisy, the dog's barking, my boyfriend is annoying me, or my husband, my wife, or whatever it is. You know, this stuff happens. I have a wife, they can be annoying. I have a child, can be annoying. So find somewhere that works for you. If you need to isolate yourself, then isolate yourself. If you can work with babies screaming, then okay. I don't think it's probably the ideal place, but you need to find somewhere where you can shut yourself off. And here's your enemy as well, that thing that Nat has in his hand. That thing is your enemy as a researcher. Sometimes what I do, and this might sound quite radical, is I turn the internet off, or I go to a place without Wi-Fi, so I can just concentrate on what I want to do without the distractions of, oh, someone needs to, I need to respond to an email, or someone's posted some rubbish on some social media, someone needs me to like, so I'm actually not even on Facebook, but anyway. But that's the sort of pressures that you have. Often the best work is when you remove yourself from distraction. Getting words to screen, well, we've talked a bit about this before. Get things on the screen, get stuff happening, organise your thoughts. Maybe have different files for literature on this or thoughts on methods, because when you're reading, you're going to be reading lots of different things. Some of it is going to be about how you're going to do the research, some of it is about what other people have already written about this topic. But you don't want to just read stuff and then 2 months later you think, well, I can't really remember what they said. Where is that article? That's creating work for yourself. Remember, if you have a vision, you'll know where things go. You'll know that this sort of stuff is about your literature review. You'll know that this sort of stuff is about demonstrating that there is a problem. You'll know that this sort of stuff is about the way in which you're undertaking your analysis. Here's a tip for doing that, or there's a particular test for doing something, and here's some thoughts about how to do that. You should have files about all of these different things so that you don't have the excuse of, oh, I'm just reading. Because as I've told you before, I've seen many people after 6 months, what have you done? I'm still reading. It's a really poor excuse. Making things easier. At this particular point in your life, I want you to think, what is the referencing style that I'll be using? What does your discipline use? I don't know if you're told to do a particular referencing style in this university. You are?
To follow a certain structure written by the graduate school. They have to visit the graduate school.
All right.
To find out the referencing style that they have to follow.
If you are told to use a certain referencing style, then you better become an expert at it, and you better become an expert at it now. And every time you write a reference down, it had better cohere with that.
Yeah.
Because you don't want a situation at the end of your thesis, oh, I've cut and pasted from the internet all these different things, and I've got volume 7, issue number 7, when your style actually means you just do 7 with the brackets and 2 or whatever it happens to be. Or does it have PPP for page numbers, or doesn't it use that? Or does it have a hyphen to show page range? Or does it have a dash? Work out what your referencing style is right now and follow it. EndNote. EndNote can be a friend, can be your enemy. I'm hopeless with EndNote, so I don't use it. But I've got other people I work with who can use it. But even they don't use it properly sometimes either. But a problem with EndNote is that people import data into it and it spits it out in a way that makes no sense. An author suddenly becomes a city and all this sort of stuff. Don't just assume if you are using EndNote that it's going to spit things out exactly as it should.
You always need to check the output.
Yeah, always. Don't just rely on it. As anyone who's familiar with Terminator or something like that, Sarah Connor, you don't trust machines, basically. Don't trust them. Computer programs, don't trust them. Always look and make sure it's doing what you want it to do, not the other way around. And as I said, all of this makes it easier at the end. It's just minimizing the workload. It's hard enough to collect data. It's hard enough to analyze data. You don't want to be spending lots of time reformatting everything at the end. Make life easy for yourself by being on top of what you're doing, by having a plan. And here's another really important thing. It's editing. You are the person who should care most about your work. You should have exceptionally high standards about your work. I print things out countless times before submitting them to a journal. The same thing for your thesis, your chapters. When you get, and it's not just a matter of getting to, I've got a thesis and let's make it look a bit better. It's a continual process from the very beginning of reading and reading and reading, revising, until you absolutely get it right, that you're absolutely comfortable with the way in which you're expressing your thoughts and the way in which your thoughts are interacting with your other thoughts. All to do with storytelling as well, of course. One good strategy I have is leave the bloody thing alone for a few weeks. Just park it. Then come back to your work and read it as if, whose work's this? Okay, I'm going to have a read of it. Read it as if you were a new reader. Read it as if you're an examiner. Read it as if you're a supervisor, whoever. Don't read it as you. Sometimes the best way to do that is to distance yourself from your work. During that time, you can maybe write an article or learn something else or whatever it happens to be. Or maybe you've gone on holidays. So you need to get away sometimes. But come back to your work with fresh and critical eyes and tear your work to pieces. Make sure you're absolutely happy with what you've got there, that you've convinced yourself that it's good. And then do it again and again. That's what you have to do. And particularly now, there's so much competition with respect to journals that your thing has to be so good to even get past the editor, to get out to the referees to look at your work. A bit different with your thesis, of course, but it doesn't hurt. And the last thing, nothing is perfect. Even my work is not perfect. In fact, it's often pretty crap. But you've got to get as close as you can to perfection. The other important thing about that is you have to let it go eventually. It's like your child. You have to let it go into the world eventually and find its own way. You just need to make sure you've done enough. But there are a lot of people who hang on to their thesis and hang on to it because it's not ready, it's not ready, it's not ready. It's never really absolutely, completely 100% ready. But you've got to get it close as you can. So there's a balance you have to achieve between the two. Supervisors. Your supervisors are there to help you. They're not your enemies. They might have different ideas to you. But you've both got two things in common. You want to pass and they want you to pass. Their careers are attached to whether you succeed or fail.
Exactly. We don't get paid until they pass. So there's a financial incentive, to that.
So they have interest a real interest in your success as well. Try to keep the relationship professional, is what I always advise. When I was supervising Nat,
Yeah, we're not this friendly.
we're not very friendly. We didn't go out drinking or what have you, driving around the country. No. Because sometimes I need to be able to say, Nat, your work is rubbish. Fix it up. This is not good enough. You can't do that when you're too friendly. Once you graduate, then you can become friends. Real friends, if that's what you want to do. But up until that point, keep your relationship professional. You're there to learn, they're there to guide you. Don't get too close, don't get too distant. Keep a friendly, amicable, professional relationship. Otherwise, I've seen some very strange things happen. Particularly when supervisors and their candidates get too close and they become sort of like some sort of strange kind of symbiotic team where they can't actually recognise whether the work's good or bad. You get what's called groupthink. And it becomes difficult to criticise because you're too friendly with each other. Got to keep it professional. Don't think you know more than they do. At the end, hopefully you know more about the topic than they do at the very end, because you're going to become the expert on that little particular thing. But they know more about being an academic than you do. So listen to their advice. And the important thing here is think of yourselves as the project leader. Often you can be working together on a project. It's often the case in Australia, I don't know the degree to which it is the case here, that there will be a project, there will be supervisors who are sort of co-investigators, but it's the HDR candidate who'll be doing the bulk of the work. In effect, they're leading the project, which means that you've all got an interest in it as well, which is a point I should have raised as well. If your supervisor isn't interested in your ideas, then it's not a good idea either. If the supervisor is not fascinated by the outcomes of your research, probably not a good topic area either. So you have to be flexible and negotiate what your topic is going to be about. If you've got this, you think it's the most wonderful idea in the world, and your supervisor says, really not interested, I don't think I can live with that for 3 years, then probably listen, because you're relying on your supervisor to really care about what you're doing. And again, a mix of perspectives is essential. Get out of groupthink. If you become too matey, too friendly with each other, you're not going to critique each other's perspectives. Another reason also why you need to send work out to a conference or a journal article to get the perspectives of people outside the group. All right, I don't want to spend another 5 minutes maybe or so before we have a break. I'll go through this quickly you've got the slides here. I'll just go through the main points that I really want to emphasise of what I call common mistakes and how to avoid them. Big one is data dumping. And qualitative researchers are guilty of this. Quantitative researchers are guilty of this. How many times have I seen a thesis where people just go, so-and-so said this, respondent X said that, the managing director of company B said this. What do I do with all this? How do I interpret all this? What's all this mean? It shows that there's no real analysis taking place. Or let's just dump a big table of data. We've run it through a model, I'm just dumping it here and I'm not really explaining what it's there for. Tables can't exist on their own in the same way as quotes can't exist on their own. So data dumping is something you absolutely must avoid, and it's related to that thing the first thing I really told you about. Important. What was that? What's the most important thing of a thesis? Storytelling. Data dumping is not effective storytelling because it means that the reader has to join the dots. Another thing, uncritical literature reviews. So-and-so says this, so-and-so says that, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. Well, who cares? What does that mean? Who's right, who's wrong? In your literature review, you need to rub ideas together. There are certain researchers or academics who have said this or have found this. But when they did their analysis, they used this particular technique. Other researchers have looked at a similar phenomenon and used this technique and found these results. Therefore, there's something that is not quite understood about this area which requires further research, etc. In this research, we'll be looking at finding a way to reconcile these two particular viewpoints. Or so-and-so came up with this, but they ignored this particular way of analysing the data. If you analyse the data in this way, they might have came up with different results, or whatever it happens to be. That's a critical literature review. It's about setting up a space. It's not about just showing that you've read lots of stuff, which is a real mistake that a lot of people do. And the other thing is, don't just bow and scrape and genuflect to past academics. They are fallible. They have made mistakes. You are there to interrogate, to ask questions, to not assume that everything you read is true. It's a valuable lesson in life in itself, is to not believe everything you read or are told. And the other thing is to show mastery of your material, that you can manipulate all this previous literature and cobble it together in such a way, place it together in such a way that you lead the reader to think the only logical conclusion is to conduct research the way in which you are going to do it. And don't be afraid to critique, don't be afraid to highlight shortcomings. Don't just assume that these people know what they're talking about. It could be you, the first person who uncovers a serious error in what someone has undertaken previously. If you find things that you don't like, if you find things you don't agree with, that's exactly what you want. It makes your thesis more interesting. It demonstrates there's a reason for doing the work. I hate theses that basically just tell me what I already know, that just replicate the same thing. A common thing I often see in certain countries is people will just do the same thing that's been done in another country in their country. Well, why? Who cares? Why do you just want to do the same thing that someone has done in Italy, Spain, whatever, and you're going to do exactly the same thing in Thailand? There might be a reason for doing it, but you need to make it very clear to the reader what is interesting about the Thai situation. Maybe it's because the institutional arrangements are different. Maybe it's because there's a different type of government style. Maybe there's different relationships between principals and agents, or whatever it happens to be. But you can't just make an argument for, oh, we need to do it in another country. That's really, really boring. You need to make a justification for why you'll do that. Look, we've talked about poor formatting before. There's plenty of material out there on this. And it goes throughout all your thesis. Make sure you understand at the start how you're going to write tables, how you're going to reference, how you're going to do subheadings and major headings. Are you going to use numbers? Are you going to use Roman numerals? Whatever it happens to be. If your university has a style guide, learn it, become an expert at it. And one thing that I've learned along the way is that examiners are often interested in making sure that you have a theoretical framework for your research. And I come from a place where theoretical frameworks weren't really used or weren't specifically stated as such. But now I realise that, hey, I did have a theoretical framework, but I didn't actually articulate it as such, because in my discipline that wasn't really necessary. But in your particular discipline, stating and making it very clear your theoretical framework is important. So if it's one thing I'd ask you to do is try to do some reading about theoretical frameworks. The most important thing is simply a theoretical framework is explaining to the examiner and the reader how you view the world. What do you privilege and what don't you privilege? And that gets into the issues about ontology and epistemology. maybe you don't need that for your discipline area. But if you do, if you're in management or marketing and so forth, then and anything that touches upon social sciences, then you probably will need to say, hey, I am taking a post-constructivist perspective on this. Or I'm a logical positivist, that I believe that things are real. And there's only one way of interpreting this information. Or are you applying a relative perspective, that this particular words can mean different things in different contexts? Show your examiner how you view the world and how you understand and interrogate how knowledge is transmitted, which is what epistemology is about. And the important thing here is that these things will help you guide your reasoning when it comes to making decisions about how you collect your data, if you're collecting data, or how to interpret the data that you already have. Because different paradigms appreciate different ways of collecting data and interrogating data. I could spend 3 hours talking about this, which is not the purpose of today, but it's something that you need to be aware of, particularly if you're going to publish your material in good journals. You'll need to make some statements along these lines. All right, we're going to take a break in a minute. Is there anything so far that you'd like to ask any questions about before we get on to publishing? Everything makes sense so far? Complicated? No? I'm just trying to break it down to the really fundamental basic things. If you take the fundamentals away, then I think you've got a good framework to build on in the future. All right, we're going to take 10 minutes break?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Okay. So I want you back here at 1:45, hopefully. Right, so with the remaining hour and a bit, I've told you how I think you should start thinking about publishing, not just writing a thesis. So just some thoughts at the start of why would you be interested in publishing? Why would you do it? Well, someone outside was talking about publishing. Maybe she could say something. Why do you want to? Why would you want to publish? Why would you bother?
Because if you don't publish, the knowledge is you just keep the knowledge to yourself. But if you publish, it can be used more widely and it can be benefit to the public.
Well, that's a very altruistic way of viewing things, helping humanity out. But what about you? What about you? Be selfish. Why are you doing it?
Because it's a requirement of my degree.
It's a requirement of your degree. Is it a requirement?
Yeah, it is. But domestic, only domestic publications.
Only domestic publications. Okay, so there's a distinction. Well, there's the thing about getting your knowledge out there. If you're only publishing in Thai, then Thai is not a language that many people study, I think, outside of Thailand, it would be fair to say. So if you're just publishing in Thai, then not many people are going to be reading it who aren't in Thailand. Yet your research could have applicability to a lot of other countries as well. So that's obviously one reason to publish in not just, what did you call them? Domestic journals, I guess. To try and have a go in an international journal. And just on that, you obviously don't want to publish things that are exactly the same, but if you could do a local version and an international version at the same time, you could probably, as long as you made it sort of structurally different, you'd probably get away with it, I would say. So you can probably have your cake and eat it too, publishing in a language like Thai. Any other ideas of why you'd publish? Because you have to. Again, that's not the sort of motivation. To what?
To get feedback.
To get feedback. And we said that briefly before. Remember that term I said? Groupthink. Groupthink is your enemy. It's why Traveling to other countries and experiencing different cultures is important because you learn that there's different ways of thinking about things. I mean, I just picked up something out there to eat and I thought, oh, this looks like something sweet. It looks like a cake or a scone or something, and I bite into it. That's got like spicy pork in it. I've learned something different about what Thai people would have for a morning tea, for instance. Having something like that for a morning tea in Australia would be very, very unusual. So getting outside of group think is very important to learn what other people think. So getting your work out to people outside of your supervisory team, outside of your institution, is important. You're going to achieve that if you publish in domestic journals, of course. But going further afield, perhaps you're exposing your work to the sorts of people who might really pick up your ideas in the future if your work is accepted. Now, I understand that publishing in an international journal is probably going to be difficult because it's not your first language, because English is generally the means of most scientific or academic communication throughout the world. You have a disadvantage compared to me, but it's a disadvantage you can overcome. Many people I know, many academics publish in English whose language is not, their first language is not English. So I appreciate that it is difficult, but it is something you can overcome. Nat, for instance, has published many articles in English language. His English writing skills are very good. So if he can do it, you can do it. Because you're probably smarter than he is.
Yeah, thank you.
So the thing is just because you are from Thailand, or, well, people from the Philippines probably are more used to English than Thai people, so maybe you have a slight advantage there. But just because you're from Thailand doesn't mean that you shouldn't be engaging the rest of the world. Nat's doing it. Hopefully, again, we're writing something at present. So you should be able to do it. Don't use that as an excuse. The other thing about why you'd bother publishing is simply because you can. It should be another one of those challenges that you've got on your list. The difficult thing is every time you send something out to a journal, you're beginning again. And every time I do that, I'm beginning again. Every time I get something rejected, it hurts, it's bad, it's not good. So even after publishing so many different things in so many different journals, and I publish in various fields as well, I'm a historian by training before I went into management and business and policy and so forth. But every time I receive reviewers' reports and so forth, it's a new experience every time. So no matter how many times you've published, it's still a challenge to get your work accepted. It's still a challenge for me today. It's particularly in the very good journals, or particularly when you're trying to move your work into different fields. And that's one thing I'm particularly keen on doing, is not just sticking in the same field, but applying principles from one field to another discipline. That's how knowledge is created in the world, by things from one discipline being applied to another discipline. So also think of the bigger context. Perhaps your article is in marketing, you're a main article, but maybe the implications of that also have something to do with a particular sector. Maybe it's marketing in the field of tourism. So you could publish something in a purely marketing journal and then create a version that's for a tourism journal, for instance. So think creatively of how you can get a couple of articles at the same time, and that's often how I work, is think of an article I can write for 2 different journals, using more or less the same material. Okay, so this is just, the things I'm saying there. And in the end there, because it's a game, do so because it's challenging, do so because you can. You might fail. but you're never going to be rewarded unless you give it a go. So don't be afraid of failure. The worst that can happen, the very worst that can happen, is you get good feedback that you can then incorporate into your thesis. That's the worst thing that can happen. The best thing that can happen is that you get your work accepted. When you get your work accepted, that makes you feel like your work has value. And as I think Nat said before, if an examiner knows that you've already had some of your work accepted, then they're less likely to be critical of your work because it's already been accepted by their peers.
Do you always get feedback, or sometimes you just get ignored?
Rejection.
There's different ways. Sometimes your articles won't go past the editor. The editor will just say, oh, sorry, thank you very much. It's not exactly what we're looking for at the moment. We wish you the best of luck at publishing elsewhere, which is basically just telling you to
Yeah,
piss off. Or other words to that effect. That can happen. That just means you just transfer it through the list of potential journals in that area. Sometimes you'll get very limited feedback of, oh, I think this work is pretty much rubbish for 1-2 reasons. Sometimes you get a whole heap of pages of stuff. Sometimes that can be annoying, particularly if the reviewers have been very pedantic. But as I said, any feedback, particularly at your stage of a career, is very useful feedback because it doesn't come from your supervisors. It doesn't come from people who have a vested interest in your work. It comes from people who are looking at your work outside of knowing who you are and where you come from. Because the good journals send things out to reviewers without telling the reviewer who you are, your name, where you come from, which is a reason why, of course, to make sure that your English is very good and so forth if you're submitting to an international journal. And the other thing, if you do want to become an academic, you actually have to do this or you'll never get a job, basically. So for those people who have some thoughts about becoming an academic, or even perhaps you mightn't become an academic now, but maybe in the future you'll return to that, it's still a good idea to publish for all of those reasons. So again, we're talking about targeting journals. So sometimes you write an article because you've got a particular journal in mind. Sometimes you're not quite sure. It's often best to have a target journal in mind. If you're not quite sure, it means you'll be struggling. And sometimes you'll have to go through 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 journals before it gets accepted. I've had articles that have gone through 3 journals, certainly, before they've been accepted. That happens. Not good for when you're wanting to get things done before you submit your thesis. So not all journals are equal. Some are extremely difficult to get into. They're the top journal in the field or in the top 3. That means that everyone in your discipline from around the world is sending their work to that journal. So if you do so, you have to be coming up with something pretty good for that journal to be interested in you. A lot of those journals have less than 5% acceptance rate. So you have to balance between how good your work actually is with actually getting some runs on the board. So targeting the very best journal in the field is probably not the best strategy. But targeting a really low journal is probably not a good strategy either, because the lower ranked journals sometimes just accept anyone or anything. Does that mean you're special? Not really. So
for first timers who would publish their journal, is it a good idea to publish at the lower ranked journal?
I don't.
High first, I think.
It depends on what you've got, and you need to make a frank assessment of its value along with your supervisors.
You got supervisor, because for myself I wouldn't know. I don't even know a single journal.
Well, you will. You will very soon. When you start writing your literature review and so forth, you'll be. And that's the thing, probably pick a journal that you're already using, because you're already having a conversation You're engaging in a conversation with academics. So,
It's just opening, you know. We have just started our
Yep.
MBA career, and I was just wondering, the journal thing is just coming up. So before we proceed on, if we're talking about the top journals, is there a way to look forward? Like, how can we see what kind of journals? How do we really?
there's various lists available. I don't know what you use here, but in Australia, huh? Shimago. Yeah, I've got it there, right there at the bottom. Or another good thing is the Australian Business Deans Council. That should be list Deans, not Dean. That ranks journals from A star, A, B, and C. Okay. The Shimago lists things according to quartiles. There's Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 in different fields. So here's a good exercise for you to do. When you start doing your literature review for your thesis, pop in some of those names on some of these databases and see where they are.
Are they free or?
Sorry?
Do you need to pay some do you have,
To submit an article.
to research for an ad? If you want to read some.
Your university should be providing that, but
Because that was what I was thinking. Because you're saying keep a journal in your mind. What kind of journal? Like your
What is your field?
MBA.
I mean MBA in what? Management.
Yes.
So probably I go for business management and accounting. Have a play around this, you know.
well, Academy of Management
And this
Review. That's a very high-ranked journals, for instance.
So for Taiwan, so it means pretty good journal.
But there's lots of quartile ones. But I'm telling you, if you go to public, was it public?
So 291 in total in in this category, business management and accounting, there are 291 journals ranked by Cymeco. So these are for Taiwan, so pretty good journal.
But as I said, there's lots of quartile ones. But you will need to learn that some of those ones, quartile ones, are on a whole nother level.
Yeah, quite difficult to get into.
Like Academy of Management Review would publish probably 2% of submissions they receive, probably less.
So we have to know about what kind of acceptance rate is there to the journals.
That's why your supervisors should be able to assist you with that. But you'll start to learn yourself. You'll start to see which are the journals that publish a lot of the stuff you actually use.
This website contains all information. You know, if you click on the name of the journal, you find out more about that journal, and you have the website link to that journal as well. And that journal will tell you the acceptance rate. From their website. See source, just click on source, and then it will direct you to the journal.
So, but at this particular point in your career, you're probably better off targeting the sort of middle of the road. Or maybe if your work is particularly good, and I don't know, it all depends on the circumstances, a little bit higher than the middle.
So this journal,
because you need to get runs on the board, basically. Well, it's probably an Australian saying from cricket. It means you have to have points, get things happening.
So this website is quite useful, for the students to find good journal for yourself to publish in. Just come to
Shimago.
Shimago.
And the other one, as I said, is what we use is the Australian Business Deans Council list. If you just type that in, you'll probably Business Deans Council list. Yeah.
If we dig deeper into these websites, can we actually read the posted journals?
You should be able to get through your library access to. You probably have an interlibrary loan thing as well. If you can't access a journal through your library, or if you find on the internet there's an article that you need to look at, then you go to the library and get them to order that article for you. It's not an excuse.
When you say library, the university's library.
Yes. They should be providing all the resources you need to conduct the research. Because without those resources, you're missing out on so much knowledge that your examiners know about. So it's no excuse to say, oh, our library doesn't subscribe to that journal. They need to be able to order that particular article you're looking for as an interlibrary loan. That's certainly what occurs in Australia. I imagine it's a very similar thing here. Your library staff are there to help you. They love helping you, that I've always found. It gives them something to do. It keeps them in a job. So there's probably a dedicated part of the library that secures books and interlibrary loans for you and also for academics like that.
The list is ranked according to alphabet, I think.
Yes.
So just say, for example, Academy of Accounting and Financial Studies Journal is ranked by ABDC as A star, which is very high ranked journal. You know, probably difficult, so difficult to get in.
Look, I don't want to talk too much more about rankings, etc., because you haven't even got an article yet. Let's get to working out how to write an article first before we work out what journal. So they're things that you need to be familiar with. Now this is a really important point, and it's also an important point for your thesis. It's what I call problematization. You need to make it clear that there is a problem in the literature, a problem in the discipline, whatever it happens to be. You need to demonstrate that there's something that people care about. The same thing for your thesis. But in the context of your article, it needs to be very specific. So essentially, you need to make a very clear case for why anyone would bother devoting some of their journal to your research, given that they are probably receiving submissions all the time from all sorts of people from all around the world. You need to make a very clear case. And one thing I say, as I put here, is you need to rub concepts together. So if we think that this theory holds, if it is valuable, if it is worth paying attention to, yet if the government or the business sector are doing this, or they have this policy, it makes a case for why we should investigate what might happen. So it's what I call rubbing concepts together, creating a kind of a friction. That's what makes things interesting. It works in much the same way as your thesis will as well, because we are talking about articles that are deriving from your thesis. So the critical thing to take home is that there's things in the literature that say something, and maybe something is happening out there in the real world that conflicts with what the literature is saying. Or perhaps we need to test what will occur if we think this theory is important and the government is doing something. Let's see if there's a conflict between the two. Let's see if we can get some information or some data that will give us more information or insight about whether that policy is going to work or not. Or if you're coming up with a media campaign or so forth. Or that doing a certain way of going about business in this industry and someone's trying to do it in another industry, what are potential barriers for that way of doing things? So that's what I call rubbing two things together, creating a friction, creating some noise, creating some heat, creating some energy. If your article is just, let's look at something, that's boring. It's got to be, let's look at something because of these reasons. Because the literature suggests that there's going to be problems with implementing that. Or the literature suggests that it hasn't worked in another country. Or perhaps it hasn't worked in a country with institutional arrangements like Thailand, for example. And that's particularly important because I imagine that a lot of you will be doing something that's Thai-centric. If so, then you need to make it applicable to a broader global audience who probably specifically doesn't care about Thailand. It's just another country. But you need to make it clear why looking at this problem in the context of Thailand is going to tell them something about what might occur in countries like Thailand or countries which have similar structures, culture, institutional arrangements and so forth. And again, think of the reviewers in the same way as you think about examiners. And remember, we said this about creating your thesis. Make sure it looks the part. If it looks like it's beautiful, then people are more willing to accept it. If it looks like a mess, people aren't going to accept it. So think of what's likely to annoy a reviewer. And one thing I will say is make sure it doesn't look like you've submitted it to some other journal before. I'm a big fan of making sure I format the journal article to exactly what the journal's requirements are. So it looks like I've targeted that journal, rather than I've targeted another journal before and it's got rejected and I'm just putting it over here. You don't want to give the editor or the reviewers any kind of signal that your work hasn't been successful previously. You want to make it look like you've written it just for them. This requires effort, but in my view it's worth doing. It's certainly what I do. And maybe it's helped a little % here and there. But sometimes it's that little extra bit of %, that little bit of extra effort that makes the difference. I can't quantify that, but it doesn't hurt. And look, these are similar things to we've discussed previously. So pointing out problems in past literature, making sure your contribution is clear, being critical, being in command. The danger often with a PhD, a candidate or a master's by research candidate is, yes, you are doing an apprenticeship. But when you're submitting something to a journal, you're playing with people who have 10, 20, 30, 40 years experience submitting things to the same journal. The challenge for you is to present yourself in as much as you can as an expert in that field, not as an apprentice. Which is why I don't know what the situation here with this university is, but working together with your supervisor. Is it normal for candidates and supervisors to publish together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a requirement as well.
It's a requirement.
You have
Okay.
to name me.
Right, but you must be first author.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if
Yeah.
otherwise if you're not first author, then there's something unethical going on,
Yeah.
shall we say. So don't let any supervisor tell you otherwise. But use their experience. I often submit things as second or third author. I'm fine to talk like this, like I'm from England. But often I will submit things on behalf of my PhD candidates because maybe the editor knows who I am or has some familiarity with me. As I said, the little bit extra percentages that might help. So I would generally encourage you to ask your supervisors to submit on your behalf, even though they're second or third author.
To be the corresponding author.
To be the corresponding author. Watch the process. Look at what they do. Another thing, it's good to have supervisors who are actually publishing actively as well. If your supervisors aren't actively publishing, then maybe you know as much as they do. There are often cases where some supervisors aren't actively publishing, and in that case they might actually make mistakes. So I can't be a judge of those sorts of situations. But if you know that your supervisor or one of your supervisory team is actively publishing, has a reputation in that field, then I think it's probably the best idea for them to be the corresponding author.
Do you have a choice to select the supervisor?
I don't know. I'm not from this university.
Do you have a choice to select the supervisor? I just
Technically, you do, but I mean, things that usually happen is that we select supervisor for you, just to make it easy. Otherwise, it might take ages for you to find the right supervisor, and it might affect your time of studying. You might not finish in. You're doing MBA, right?
Yes.
You might not be finishing in 2 years if you just spending time finding supervisor. So
those factors will be considered by you.
yeah,
The one
but
who's
you
actively-
obviously you can mention that, oh, I want to be supervised by this person, or you can.
My recommendation would be to have a look at the faculty list, see which of those people are publishing in your area
And then
actively,
approach them.
and contact them
Yeah.
and make a case and convince them to go, hey, I think she's good. I'm interested in her topic. That's what I said, have a discussion. Try to build up a topic together sometimes that you're both going to be interested in. That's certainly what I recommend. Just coming to someone with an idea and not being prepared to change, that can be a problem. Because if your supervisor doesn't really like what you're doing, then they mightn't give you the attention that you really need.
You have to choose wise as well. I mean, supervisor is everything, you know,
Yes.
for completing your master or PhD. I mean, yeah, choose wisely.
Yes.
Exactly.
Choose wisely. And try to get one that's, as I said, actively publishing if possible. If you want to publish, if you think it's important for you, if you're one of the people who, like you, want to become an academic, it's essential for you, in particular, to find an academic to supervise you who is an active publisher. Particularly important for you. All right, what we're going to do for the room, lots of pressure for you there, but we've all got pressure. What I'm going to do now is let's just briefly, and we're not going to write a paper together, obviously, because we've only got, what, 35 minutes. What I'm going to do is give you a hypothetical situation where together as a group, we'll try to piece together what a paper might look like to give you a bit of an idea. Of course, you're going to be getting an idea because you're going to start reading academic journal articles very soon. One thing I should point out is you quickly need to identify what is peer-reviewed academic research in a journal as opposed to just general rubbish published on the internet. Making that distinction between a genuine peer-reviewed journal that carries weight in the academic community as opposed to an outlet of material or resources that really isn't much better than Wikipedia. In fact, could be worse than Wikipedia. Making that distinction is a critical thing, and sometimes it takes a bit of skill. But have a look at publishers, for example. I mean, your main publishers are going to be things like Elsevier, Wiley, Springer, Routledge. When there's some publishers that are, who knows, some strange thing that you've never heard of before, they're probably not good journals. So this is a learning, I mean, you're beginners. We can't expect you to know everything. There's a lot to learn, admittedly. That's where your supervisors, a good supervisor who is actively publishing, who knows what's being written about that topic area in which journals, is going to be the sort of person you need to navigate, help you navigate your way through this space, because there's so much out there. You need to differentiate between the quality of the sources, because you don't want your thesis filled with using really low-grade material when you're referring to the literature, because an examiner or a reviewer in the case of your article is simply going to say, you've missed out so much. All right, here's my idea. This is all very hypothetical. What's that? Does that look familiar?
Did you actually take a photo of this?
No, it's from the internet.
Okay.
Does that look familiar? Anyone living in Bangkok has seen this kind of thing before? So, when I came here last time, because I've written a bit about public infrastructure provision and the kind of models that the public sector uses to provide infrastructure, I tend to go around different cities and go, what's going on here in terms of public transport in particular? Now, when I came to Bangkok, I think the second time, Nat was driving me around, and I see all of these overhead SkyTrain, is that the word? SkyTrain?
Yes,
SkyTrain.
BTS.
Everywhere. And lots of lines that are now being developed. So it's continuing, this process of putting in this kind of public transport is continuing. But, now this is where we talk about the concept, remember, of rubbing things together. Rubbing concepts, literature together. So we've got one thing happening here. This is a policy. The Bangkok or whoever is in control of the provision of this sort of public transport has a policy of doing rail by this means. The reason, of course, is that in Bangkok there was a lot of traffic and then they decided, well, we need more roads. And if any of you have any economic inkling about you, you'll know of a concept called induced demand. If you build more roads, they fill up with more cars, and you get to exactly the same point. Therefore, you need to do something else. Let's try public transport. So, we see a lot of this here in Bangkok. Now, that's the policy. Let's just call that the policy, what's going on. So there's something to be interrogated about that. Why? Because if you look at the urban planning and public transport literature, and that about infrastructure provision, you would know that there's something inherently problematic about rail that's up in the air, particularly with respect to how you fund it. This thing costs money. You're paying for this, particularly if you're a Thai citizen. Or if you're not paying for it now, you will be paying for it in the future when you start paying lots of tax. You've got an interest in this. We've all got an interest in this. So the issue here, if you read the literature, is that if you elevate public transport, what is the problem, do you think?
Maybe the traffic jam, because you use one of the traffic lane to elevate the sky train instead of underground.
Well, there's a critical thing in there, underground versus underground.
It makes more room for the car on the surface of the road.
That's possibly a problem, but in the case of the concept of saying if you keep putting more roads in, you keep ending up with more traffic anyway. But the underground thing is important. Underground costs more money than overground. But underground has an advantage because people can connect more easily to it. It becomes part of their daily lives. If it's underground or if it's on the surface, it stitches itself into the broader community. And people use it and access it more easily and what's more important, they want to live near it. And if you want to live near it, what do you think happens to the area?
Crowded.
It becomes crowded, but what happens to the property value?
Pardon?
What happens to, do you think would happen to the property value?
Still rising.
It will rise. And that's what we know around the world, is where public infrastructure for transport is put in place, which is either underground or at grade, which is at the surface, we see a tremendous uplift in property values around that infrastructure. Now, the literature tells us is when you separate infrastructure like this, you don't get that same effect. Now, if you don't get that same effect, it becomes a problem because it just means that government is procuring that through a tender. Private sector going, all right, we can produce it for this amount of money. But what's happening around the world is that governments are using what's called value capture. Now, let's just say we've built a train station next to where you live. Your property value should increase. If so, you're getting that for free. You should be paying for that. So there should be some kind of taxation or some kind of means of capturing the value that's increased. Now, if you can do that, imagine what that would mean for new infrastructure. It would mean that it's not just government paying for it or the taxpayer, it's the people who will benefit from using this resource into the future. So getting back to the point of what I was trying to say about rubbing concepts together, you can see that there is a policy here of doing something in Bangkok. Yet the literature, the theory, tells us that if you do that, you won't be able to capture the value in the same way as you would if you did it at the surface or below the ground, which means that the government is limited in the ways in which it can fund that particular infrastructure. Now that is what you call rubbing two concepts together. I mean, here's just another picture of this. Now, can you see here that this is a big, ugly, grey thing? Do you want to spend time around here? You want to get there and you want to get out of there really quickly. And it's the point that you were making before, that you've got roads around it as well. Roads are antithetical to value uplift. People don't want to be building a restaurant there. Property developers don't want to be buying that land and building high-rise developments. So what it means in Thailand, or Bangkok in particular, is that there is possibly a revenue stream that government might not be able to access to fund this kind of infrastructure. Here's a difference, for example. This is happening in my city. We're putting back what's called light rail, like a tram or so forth. Around the tram stops, we know property prices are increasing dramatically. A friend of mine has an apartment near one of the tram stops. His property has increased dramatically. But he's not paying any, he didn't pay anything for it. But in the United States and in Europe, means are being put in place to capture the value uplift, to sell rights to property developers, so that money can go back into the way in which the infrastructure is funded in the first place, which is benefits for you as a taxpayer, benefits for the environment, more people living closer to public transport, benefits for the economy, reducing externalities associated with private vehicle use, congestion, injury, death. When you die in a car crash, you're not paying taxes anymore. The government really doesn't want you to die. So there's external costs associated with road user transport. Here's just an example I found from the internet. Each of these things is where there is public transport, underground or at grade. So you can see here, quite visually, that where you see access to public transport, there is development, quite graphically so. What you'd want to see, hopefully, in Bangkok is a similar situation. Yet, from what I've seen, just travelling around, these train stations are often very isolated. There's nowhere to go towards a park, there's no apartments often close. Often there's a big, long, sort of a gangway kind of a thing to a shopping centre. So, to go back to publishing, I can see here, from what the literature tells me, that there's something interesting going on here that you could possibly interrogate, because we've got a policy that's saying one thing, we've got literature and theory saying something else quite different. What would be interesting is to have a look what's actually occurring, because I'm just surmising this. I don't know. I haven't gone out there and looked at property values around a station area. This is what's happening in China. A model that was brought to China from Hong Kong, from MTR, whose whole thing is, we get some land from the government, we build a station, we bring transport there, we get the rights to build big things above there, but we have to pay for this. We have to pay for the right to do it. So it's a benefit for everyone. So, this is just a bit of background, theoretical, contextual information that I want you to consider. And I'm sorry for this slide here, something happened when it got transmitted. So I was thinking about this last time I was in Bangkok. And the key points is new public transport usually results in a value uplift for surrounding real estate. Be that residential, be that commercial. And what I saw is in Bangkok is that there's a lot of this and there's continuing to be a lot of this. And I see that there's new lines that are being developed in the years ahead. So there is a commitment to this in Bangkok. I don't know why this, I presume it's to do with cost. that this is a cheaper alternative to going underground, or there's likely to be too much political repercussion of getting rid of a road or getting rid of half a road and putting the railway there. Because people like Nat, who just drive everywhere and don't use public transport, would be upset and not vote for the government anymore, or whatever it happens to be. So the question I have is, do these activities result in the same kind of public value uplift that we see in other places? We know, as I said, that public transport at grade, at the ground level or underneath, generates value uplift. We know in other places where public transport is located next to main roads that nothing much happens in terms of value, because people don't want to live next to roads. People don't want a restaurant next to a road. That's the sort of thing that occurs. If you have a look at a city, have any of you here been to a city called Melbourne in Australia? No?
I have.
You have?
Yeah.
I have. No one else has. In Melbourne, do you know what trams are? Light rail? Like what I showed you before? These things. There's lots of these. Melbourne is one of the few cities in the world that kept light rail or trams. The rest of the world ripped them up to favour the car. Now we're all putting these things back in cities throughout the world. What you see in Melbourne is that on the streets where these things are, there's cafes all along them. There's restaurants. On other streets in Melbourne where the buses are, there's nothing. It's just dingy entrances to offices and so forth. There's no life, there's no vibrancy. The thing that you can extrapolate from that is that light rail, like this, is clean. It's not really that noisy. It integrates with people's lives much more easily than catching a bus, which is often moves around, it's noisy, often diesel pollution, it stinks. It's not a place that's going to encourage investment. So there's lots of empirical evidence out there in the world to underpin the sorts of things I'm talking about here. So, what does all this mean for funding models for the provision of this? As I said, in places in the United States and in Europe, and also I think in Sydney, Australia, they're going to do this, new projects are going to not just be funded by government, but will also be funded through people who will benefit from the value uplift in real estate, or they will be given rights to develop apartments and so forth. So just imagine, now I've told you all these different things that you thought, oh, there is something interesting here about Bangkok that we don't really know. Can we prove, however, that this is a problem? Maybe it isn't a problem. So,
I'm not too sure if that's a problem, because it comes to me that, you know, property nearby public transport, especially the BTS, they get value uplifted as well.
Do they?
But I'm not too sure if that, you know, a lot compared to property near the MRT. MRT is the
yep.
low, yeah. What do you call?
Subway.
Yeah, subway. So we have to prove, you know, whether the value uplift between property nearby the MRT and property nearby the BTS are different or not. Significantly different.
So it's a question of how would you structure an article about this? And look, we're not writing an article here. What I want to talk about is the way in which you would put your narrative together. So what's the first thing an article has?
Title.
A title?
Yeah, exactly.
So you're going to have a title that captures what this is about. So in this particular case, maybe it's something to do with public value uplift, or Bangkok's SkyRail system.
And you have to mention the subway as well, right? Because we're going to investigate value uplift between property nearby the subway and property nearby the sky.
Well, that's the question for when you're writing an article versus a thesis. My feel is that if you are writing a thesis, you would probably want to do two. But if you're writing an article, you could probably do both separately to compare. I mean, you need a control, basically. So if you could compare what occurs when Sky Rail is put in place as opposed to what happens with property prices when you put the subway in place. So this is where you're thinking holistically in terms of a bigger project. But if you were to write a thesis, yes, you probably should do that. But if you're writing an article, maybe the right path is to do each separately. So you get a separate article out of each. And then maybe another article where you put both together.
Comparison. Wow.
A comparison.
So you get 3.
So that's how you've got to think about writing articles, is how you can do little self-contained pieces that then fit together into a bigger whole. And that's precisely what you want to do with your thesis. Because you can't publish the whole thesis quickly, certainly. But you could publish elements of it as you go. So you've got your title. Then, of course, you've got your introduction. But what would you do in your introduction?
Talking about the literature, right? Oh, maybe we have to introduce Bangkok first.
Well, you'd take things at a much more abstract level. You would say that around the world, what's the big theme at play here? Can you grasp from what I've said? What is the big theme? What is the discourse, we say? What is the discourse that this is associated with?
Taxation.
Close, very close. Yeah, that's linked to taxation, but what's above that? What is the discourse? What is the conversation about?
Policies.
Policy to do with what? Yeah.
To tax people living around.
Any other ideas? Public infrastructure provision and the models that are used by government to efficiently do this. In a background of government has to deal with so many different public values, health, defence, education, public transport. With all of these things to deal with, government needs to do this as efficiently as possible. So if government could find out a way of doing this at the lowest costs, with the greatest benefit for the citizenry, then that's what the discourse is about. So when you're writing an article, in your introduction, you need to really effectively link it to that bigger conversation, the discourse that your article relates to. The same thing with your thesis. Because I've talked a lot of concepts here. I've talked about taxation. I've talked about public transport. Talked about real estate. But it really all sits under the models that are actually used to fund public infrastructure, such as public transport. So in the introduction, that's where I'd introduce that notion that governments have a variety of different things to deal with in modern society. Governments need to find efficient ways of funding all of these different things, public transport being one of them. Then shift to around the world, governments are finding different ways to fund public infrastructure. One of the ways they're doing this in terms of public transport is by using what we talked about before, value capture mechanisms, of finding ways to capture the value that is created when infrastructure is built in the first place. Then, probably your third paragraph in your introduction, you'd go, Bangkok is a place where government has struggled to deal with a vast population that wants greater urban mobility. But highways and roads haven't worked. They've just created more congestion. As a response to this, there has been a policy of putting more urban rail in place. One of the ways by which government has done this is through the provision of this SkyTrain system. And then you're starting to rub concepts together. You would then say, but there are questions about the degree to which this way of providing infrastructure is able to create additional value that could be captured for future investment in public transport infrastructure. So can you see there how I've taken a number of concepts together and rubbed them slightly against each other to get the reader to a certain point of, hey, there's a problem. There's something that could be investigated. Any issues with that? Can you see how you could apply a similar way of thinking to your research? That's what I want you to consider. Policy here or something, literature there, rub them together, there's a bit of noise. There's something we don't quite understand, particularly in a different context. So that's how you'd probably start off an article like this. The second thing, what does an article generally have? No.
Yeah.
Colin, some people here must have been looking at some academic articles. And I'll tell you one thing right now is that what an article looks like is very much what a thesis looks like, in a very compressed form. A phrase that I often say is that a thesis is really just an article on steroids. It has the basic fundamental principles behind it, just at a much smaller, self-contained level. What do you think would be the second thing in an article? Yeah. And I mean, generally you call this kind of, I don't know, people say literature review. I'm not a big fan of this concept, but you're going to hear it enough, so I may as well use it here. Now, often in that literature review, you might have something like, you know, the background or the case in question. Or perhaps in this case, that might come down there. I'm just thinking out loud. I haven't planned this, I'm just making this up as I go along. I would actually suggest something would come before the background and the case. And as I said, with modern technology, we can move this stuff around. So don't be afraid to move stuff around.
Problem statement?
Your problem statement more or less comes at the end of your introduction, really, when we said, hey, if we rub these things together, there's a bit of an issue. But you've got to demonstrate what you know here, don't you? Literature review. It should be pretty clear what you're going to put in next. Your literature. You've got to put together, remember what I said, your theoretical framework. What are the things that are important to bear in mind? So you'd probably have something to do with value capture. Like, how do you do this? What's it about? What does this term mean? How is it applied? Then maybe you'd have something about how it's been used. Or where it doesn't work. So as I said, there's plenty of literature out there to suggest that property value doesn't rise that much when you have roads next to things, when your access points to public transport are isolated, because it's an unpleasant environment. We know this, we have evidence, we have data. We know this in Australia, for example, in the city of Perth, where the train lines have all been placed alongside the road. We don't see those, remember I showed you those towers and things over the train stations. We don't see that. We know that where there is road next to public transport, we don't see value uplift. And so at the end of that, you need to link all this back. And I guess it's what you said there before, you know, that there is a problem. And as I said before, what I'd probably do is put the background case right at the end there. I wouldn't know if that works properly until I actually wrote an article about it. And as I keep saying, don't be afraid to move things around. So now that we've come up with, you know, the stuff that's out there, there's the concept of value capture. There's evidence of where it doesn't work. And in fact, you might want to have before that just on infrastructure provision models in a very general sense. Provision, I can't spell. But in an article, you can't have heaps of literature. It has to be condensed. We've only got about 7,000 or 8,000 words to play with. So we can't have lots of space. So in an article, we've gotten to a position where we've established what we know about what's out there. We know what the literature tells us. We think that there might be something worthy of investigation. What do you think we'd do next? Any ideas? How would we go about dealing with this?
Analyze.
Analyze comes after. We need to do something before. Sorry? Discussion? No. We've got to collect some. We've got some ideas here, but
Research.
yeah, we actually have to do research. We have to collect some data. So let's just pretend we've collected our data, and there's various ways we could do this. But the next thing in the article we would be doing is what? Absolutely, yeah. And there's a difference between methods and methodology. Methodology is the inquiry about why you use particular methods. Remember I talked to you before about ontological positioning and epistemological positioning, etc. That's to do with your methodology. Sometimes things like this are more the methods. What did you actually do? So you need to justify, explain, and most importantly of all, make it replicable. If someone couldn't do the same thing, then your research is rubbish. In fact, it could be fake. And there have been many cases of articles that have been retracted by famous journals because someone else tried to do the research again and couldn't come up with the same thing because they falsified data. So you have to make sure that you explain and justify what you're doing. So in this particular case, and I need to hurry up a little bit, I see. An idea might be, for example, is to longitudinally, if you could, measure what happened in that space before there was public transport, and then take some various points until you get to the present day, and are you seeing any kind of market upshift in public value?
For studying PhD degree, is it appropriate to do the longitudinal research, because longitudinal research takes a long time and it may delay the graduation of the degree?
Absolutely. You can't do longitudinal research starting from here and forward. Unless finance you can, because you can make observations at an hourly level if you really want to, or even more fine-grained than that. But if you're collecting data about an organisation, no. But you can go backwards. So if you could find some way of calculating value of real estate within that space and could keep that consistently, you would see whether there are any patterns. You'd probably do this via a time series approach. You'd probably need to incorporate some dummy variables in there, because there might have been a financial crisis, there might have been a disaster.
So it's like for finance, you use the past data and you generate time series, and your forecast is your longitudinal research, right?
But if you're doing something about intervention of a certain policy, you can't really do that in the confines of a master's by research or a PhD, because that might be a 10-year process of observation, or even if it's a 3-year process, that's still too long for doing research. So the third thing there you'd basically have is where you're describing what you're doing in this hypothetical case and justifying it, because there are probably many ways of doing this, but you need to say, this is the way I'm doing it, and I'm doing it for this reasons. What would be ideal is to see if anyone has done this previously. And I'd say this has been the case, because consultants around the world have been at the forefront of pushing this means of financing public infrastructure. So it's quite likely that someone has used a method that you could take from, say, Oregon, where this has occurred, in North America, and use it in a precinct around a station. And the literature always tells us that we can say what is a precinct around a station. It is a certain amount of meters away from it. So you could perhaps take a number of different things, maybe a few residential apartments, maybe a few shops, and see what the difference is over time.
So it's a good idea to use the method that somebody already used before?
It is often a very handy thing to do, but you probably need to adapt it.
To your context?
Yes, exactly. Because of the constraints of the data. I don't know, I was discussing this with Nat, where would you find this data? There could be government valuations, appraisals, or there could be data that's available from real estate sites to help people make a decision about whether a property is worth buying or not. I can certainly find that data in Australia. It's not always accurate, but it has to stand in for something. So it becomes a proxy. Because we can't actually go out there within 400 metres or what have you of each train station, measure everything and see how it's changed over time. We need a bundle of things that we can use as proxies to establish whether there has been some change over time. Because remember, this article is not about saying that we should use value capture mechanisms. We're just trying to see whether this kind of infrastructure could be associated with that or not, as the case might be. And that's the thing, the difference of an article compared to a thesis. A thesis might be what Nat said, comparing this versus underground metro rail or a bus stop or whatever. In an article, a much more precise focus. And we're running out of time by the looks of it. So there's essentially three things there. And just to run through, after you have methods, what do you have? Sorry? You'll have your findings plus your analysis. It depends on your discipline. Sometimes these things are done together, sometimes they're done separately. Often qualitative researchers put a lot of data down and try to tell a bit of a story before actually analysing it, thematically using coding and so forth. So in this particular hypothetical case that I'm giving you, here is where you would actually probably put, maybe we use, well, if we go back to methods, maybe we're just going to use 3 stations along a certain line, because we can't collect data for everything. There are limitations to all research. So maybe we just use the 3 stations to do this along a certain line. Then in here, we report what we find for 3 stations at particular points in time and see what we end up with. Then after that, what would we do? Someone said it before, a D word. We need some discussion about what this means. And this is where you link it back, your discussion, linking it back to the literature. The literature predicted this. The literature says we should find this. What did we find? Maybe we find in Bangkok that value increases tremendously around train stations, these sky rail things, despite the literature telling us that it probably shouldn't, because it's distance from people, it's surrounded by roads. So this is where, in your findings, you link back to what the literature would suggest we should find. Very important part, of course, of your article, which, as I said, is about really going back and offering something, making a contribution back to the literature. And then if we did find that there was a difference, then we'd have to try and explain it, wouldn't we? Maybe there's something in Bangkok that makes real estate work next to a highway. I don't think it does, that's my guess. But if it did, we'd probably have to try and find some explanation. Otherwise, we could then look at, in here, you'd also link to implications. I.e., in the context of Bangkok, sky, train or rail or whatever you want to call it, does not present itself as an appropriate vehicle to augment the funding of public infrastructure. Meaning that if government continues to persist with this, then it's taxpayers who will be paying for this, that there's no real ability. But you could extrapolate from this as maybe government is also thinking of other programs, and maybe this is ammunition to say we should be having more of this kind of public transport, where there's more likelihood of being able to capture value. And finally, just as I need to probably conclude this session,
Recommendations for further research?
well, you have your concluding remarks. And yes, you can stipulate some limitations. There's future research. And that's maybe where you'd link to your future article on what happens in Bangkok with underground rail. To really understand whether there is something going on here, we might need to compare this with another transport mode to see whether this is possible with underground rail or metro or whatever you want to call it. So this is how you continue to build up a program of research that will carry you forward. Don't put all your ideas in one paper. It's a common mistake. So hopefully with this, I've given you a bit of an idea of how you can construct an idea of writing a paper really easily. And hopefully this is a sort of approach you can also take to your thesis when you consider about what you want to write about. And this is just me observing something out there, wandering about or driving about the city. Something that I saw that didn't quite make sense to me or presented a problem from my understanding of the literature. And that's what I'd ask you to do when you're considering what topic you want to do, is to consider how you can rub concepts together to create a space where you can make some kind of contribution. So, as I said, that's just a hypothetical example, and we have to finish up now, I'm guessing. How do I get back to this? So just some things to reflect on. Remember, discourse is the thing that, from this discussion of articles, I want you to take away. Consider the discourse. What sort of discourse have we been discussing here? Again, public infrastructure provision and the models of public infrastructure provision. We could send this to different types of journals. we could make a version that we send to a public policy journal that's very generally interested about public infrastructure. In the same way that we could do something similar about power stations or something similar about bridges or whatever it happens to be. Funding models for public infrastructure. But we could also send a version to a transport-related journal that's specifically about transport planning. So even within one type of research, you can spin it in different ways and get additional mileage out of your work. If you plan things, if you have a vision for what you want to do. So consider those sorts of things when you're making your decisions. And level of journal, you won't really know until you end up with the end of it. If you've got something that's vastly contradictory to what the literature tells us to expect, then maybe we should aim a bit higher because it's going to be really interesting. If not, then maybe more of a mid-tier kind of journal. So that's really all we have time for today. I hope that hasn't been too complicated for you. Life is going to become complicated for you as you move forward with research. But if you apply yourself, if you really want it, then I'm sure you will achieve it. And I really do hope that you consider trying to plan your research in such a way that you can publish from it sooner rather than later. I think that's going to be very valuable for you, particularly if you want to become an academic or if you just simply want to get your research out there and be noted in that field. And it's not going to hurt at all when it comes to an examiner looking at your work and you've cited yourself somewhere in there in a good quality peer-reviewed journal. So with that, I wish you the very best for your studies in future. And I'm sure if you get to that point where you submit your thesis, it will all be worthwhile. So thank you.
ขอบคุณมากนะครับที่มาร่วมแล้วก็นะครับขอให้โชคดีเดี๋ยวผมได้เจอกันหลายๆคน I'm gonna be teaching you guys as well I think semester finance are you doing finance yeah so see you soon
Thank you for coming.
So thank you for coming. All right, I think there's a lunch for you guys. Well, you prepare lunch. Tonight, good, right? It's free.
Huh?
You charge and also you get lunch for free. อย่าลืมนะครับมีอาหารกลางวัน Thanks.
Thank you. Pleasure.
ไม่ใช่ผมคนเดียวครับผมหัวหน้าภาคเลยแต่ว่าอีกด้วยสองคนผมน่าจะแค่ถึงบ้านผมน่าจะไปสองวันผมไม่ได้เป็นคนจัดการผมเป็นต้องถามหน้าภาคเขาว่าเขาแอดไซน์แต่เขาแอดไซน์ให้ผมไปสอนนี่เรียนไปแล้วเหรออ๋อเรียนไปแล้วใช่ผมไปสอนรุ่นใหม่อย่างI'm going to be teaching this guy. Hopefully. Yeah.
So everyone's doing finance?
No. But they have to study finance with me. One subject with me. Corporate finance. Financial management. Yeah. I'll be teaching them this semester.
Well, behave in Nat's classes.
Yeah, please behave.
Behave. All right. There's that. Nat.
Thank you. Yeah, and finance student.
More finance students.
กับสิงคโปร์